Welcome back to my channel. My name is Carly Stevens. This is Carly Stevens Books for all things writing, publishing, and indie author life. And I have the privilege of being here with Tracey Barski. She lives in Colorado with her husband of 10 years and their two children. She is the author of the Alternate Chronicles, as well as several other books. When she's not writing or wrangling tiny humans, she works as a proofreader and a sign language interpreter. For fun, she likes to pretend to be 80 years old. Very relatable. Crocheting and watching Hallmark movies. She can also be found reading or singing loudly to any song she knows the words to. So, welcome,
Absolutely.
Tracy.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, of course. I'm excited to talk about time travel and alternate timelines and
Mhm.
some of those things that have just mystified me that I've never tried before, but they definitely show up in your writing. So before we kind of get into that topic specifically, tell me a little bit about how you got into writing in the first place.
Yeah, I think just like a lot of people, it started with a love of reading. And when I was in middle school, I had read a series of books that really inspired my love of reading, but they were also it was hard to find books that I liked and enjoyed. And so I couldn't get enough of that one style of story. At the time, I was very picky about what genre I read, and so I just started writing my own, mostly for fun, and to be honest, it was kind of glorified fan fiction before fan fiction was a thing,
Nothing wrong with that.
and yeah, and so, it wasn't great, but that's how I got started, and I was probably about 13 and just kept writing stories from that point on with no intention of doing anything with them. I just really liked doing it, so um, yeah, and it just kinda stuck with me. I hadn't made any steps or taken, um, or made any plans even to publish or anything like that, but carried up into my adult years and just kept writing just for myself, so, yeah.
I mean, you're your own first reader, right?
Yeah.
If you really enjoy it, then, somebody else is bound to love what you love.
Yeah, exactly. I figure if it's just for me, it's fine, I can kinda do whatever, so now it kind of matters a little bit what I write, how well I write it, but
Yeah, I mean, yeah, there are a lot of pros to publishing your stuff, but that complete freedom starts to kind of be tempered a little bit. I know what you mean.
definitely.
So you write in the alternate chronicles.
Mhm,
There's an alternate timeline that's central to the entire thing.
mhm.
How do you approach alternate timelines or time travel? Let's just start there. How do you approach that? Like, what's your philosophy of alternate timelines and working with those?
Yeah, I mean, it gets complicated really fast. Um, so and to be honest, when I wrote my first book, or the first book that I published, which was the first in the Alternate Chronicles, I wrote it just for myself, so I kind of fudged some of the rules or, kind of didn't really know what I was building at the time. Um, so when I planned to publish it, I spent a little bit more time being intentional about what I was putting in there, and honestly, with time travel and alternate realities and that kind of thing, obviously, we it's not possible right now. So, I mean, as far as we know. Um, so you have a lot of artistic license that goes with that, but you still have to make it make sense in some way. Um, and that has been one of the biggest challenges with it, and so, I used a little bit of um, things I'd learned from because what inspired the story was a show on the History Channel where they were talking about string theory and parallel universes, and
Ooh.
so that's what kind of inspired it. So I went and researched kind of what the general prevailing theory is about parallel universes and this concept of so they're like real theories about your life, every decision you make splitting to accommodate how your life would change if you chose the blue dress versus the red dress. Um, And then I kind of played around with, my characters are experiencing it, but they're experiencing it like we would, where we don't know why or how. So then they're going and researching and finding out some of these true theories that people have. Um, and then it was a matter of figuring out a plausible explanation that I could kind of run with, which has been fun, but very hard to make it believable enough.
Mm.
And, um, I think it's slightly easier with alternate realities than time travel because
Yeah,
time
I
travel.
was gonna ask about they have a lot in common, but,
Yes.
do you see them as kind of the same thing, or it sounds like you don't?
I don't necessarily, because at least with the alternate timelines, parallel universes and stuff, you don't go back and forth in time. It's just, to me, it's side by side. Like I jump to this reality, it's the exact time of day, um, and whatever else. Like I can't go back to yesterday in an alternate reality. It's still time is still moving forward.
Just
Um,
parallel.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly. And so, but it's a fascinating concept because if you think about, if you look at parallel universes of just your own life and the various, choices that could have changed the trajectory of how things happen in your life, but there's also a lot of things historically that can play a role in how a world develops. Like if Hitler never came to power, what would the world look like today? If whatever major or even minor historical events didn't take place, how much would the world change?
Mm.
And so there's a lot of room to look at parallel universes that are almost identical, but just slightly different in one way or another, whether that's your own life or society at large, or vastly different, like our entire world is underwater and we all, travel by boat everywhere, or who's in power, uh, did our country form into the United States, that kind of thing where you can explore all of those things. And I kind of turned it into a micro concept where we're just focusing in on this one character's experiences of other versions of her own life. So because it gets big really fast, and then it's,
As you were
uh
talking, I was thinking it's overwhelming to consider going backwards in history with these just layered parallel universes.
yeah.
So it makes sense to kind of have a focal point and run with that instead.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've played around with having characters or describing a world that is vastly different than our own, and there's kind of I touch on it a little bit in the 3rd book, but I don't go into much detail because it's not essential to the plot, but it is like, just so you know, they do exist, like these
Mm.
really funky versions of our world where it's dark and scary and, dangerous and things like that. So, but yeah, I try to keep the focus, especially because of the way the 1st book plays out. Um, it's such a close parallel of her world that, she meets people who know the other version of herself, but the other version of herself is dead. So it's kind of like just the focal point of like the people who are affected by the fact that she's a different version of someone they know and love, and how that affects her. And, you know, um, it just gives me a lot of room to work in just this small area, but there's so much you could do and expand. And that's just parallel universes. When you add in jumping forward or backward in time, it makes your brain want to explode. So I was like, I'm not touching it.
Okay, so a few questions are coming to mind. So you have parallel universes that coexist simultaneously along the same trajectory of time. And it sounds like, I mean, well, I guess the premise essentially of your first book is the idea that there is there are 2 versions of the same person who coexist in that same timeline. So 2 versions, same timeline.
Yeah.
So talk to me about that and some of the consequences that might have, like, ripple effects into other timelines. How do you handle that? Or is it just that she got freakishly transposed and then everything's all confined to the one? Like,
Yeah, I mean,
that's problems.
I kind of so in the main thread of the trilogy that I have, because I have a side story and then I have 2 more that I'm gonna write that are connected to it. But in her story, she goes she is transported but stays in the same place, but it's the same or it's a different universe. So she's in the same room when she wakes up, but everything else is different. And the other version of herself was killed by a serial killer. And so who hasn't been caught. So then there's this aspect of what if the serial killer sees that she's like back and that would throw him off and then all these
Mm,
people who are mourning her are interacting with her and just the kind of um the difficulty that comes with that and I kind of use
mm,
the alternate reality more as a backdrop for relationships and um like there's a lot of trauma healing and things like that that go along in the story and it's so the alternate reality becomes more of the background and less of the focus even though
mm,
there's that element that they're trying to figure out how and why she's there um and then because the other version of herself is dead there's no weird um like space-time continuum like Back to the Future but
meeting self and all that.
yeah in my side story, he goes to an alternate version of his life, and there is another version of him, but he doesn't live in that specific place. So they exist in that same world, but they never interact together. But I'm gonna play around with and actually in the series, I do have some characters interacting with other versions of themselves, and there's no like weird explosion or, you know, nuclear meltdown or anything like that. But it does kind of bring up these ideas of what would happen if I killed this other version of myself, and that's like gives people the heebie-jeebies and things like that. But it doesn't have necessarily an impact on that world at large necessarily. So, but I think that's, that's just the way I built it because I have a lot of freedom to do that with fiction. Um, but it gets complicated fast and I have to think of timelines and different um, details about the different versions and how to make it all work and tie in together. And it was really hard when I was writing the second book
Mm,
because I published the first book and I had only written maybe half of the second book. And so then I was like, oh crap. So now this one's out in the world. So I have to reconcile everything that already exists in the story rather than build something that goes along and it all ties together um, which I feel like I did fairly well, keeping all of these threads that are really complicated to reconcile. But I feel like it worked out. I haven't had anybody be like, you didn't like this whole thing doesn't make sense at all and the entire plot collapses or anything like that. So I don't know.
so you must be doing something right.
I guess.
So how do you keep the stakes high? This is something that sometimes bothers me with time travel kinds of stories because, death never sticks and you can
Yeah,
always kind of go back and forth. Like when you have both time travel and alternate universes, I feel like it's easy to fall back on some sort of easy magical answer. Did you like put
yeah.
up guardrails for yourself or just tell me about how you are able to keep those stakes high and keep yourself from just kind of magicking a solution.
Yeah. I think um I'm not a very intentional writer. I'm definitely a pantser and sort of go a little crazy and just let myself. But I think because there were alternate timelines, there were new, um, complications for my main character in each of the books.
Mm,
Because the first one is the whole concept of what happened to me and how do I get back, and all these people are mourning me, like, because I built my main character with quite a tragic backstory, which, I mean, don't we all? But she has to kind of figure out how to navigate these relationships that don't exist for her in her real world, and a big theme, like I said, was is forgiveness in the first one, and then the second one, she's in a new timeline, and she's trying to figure out, am I in the right one or the wrong one? And that's a big element of the second book. And then the third one has a lot of, I'm seeking all these answers, but trying to find all the answers might just kill me.
mm,
And so um it is really hard to keep the stakes high enough, which I think is why I have 3 side stories that are different characters, but similar concepts, but we're hitting different elements that come along with, the different questions you might have about alternate universes, whereas the main series was very focused on her development as a person
mm,
with, like I said, that backdrop of the alternate reality, and it just kind of plays with this question for all of them, but in her story specifically, like, if my life had played out this way, would my life really be better? Or
mm,
the things that I think should have happened or should not have happened, that I blame for my problems or whatever, would that have changed the outcome? Would it have made it better or would it have made it worse? And
mm.
kind of understanding why we are in the place we are, you know? So, I mean, that's an overarching theme that I kind of play with in the whole series, and I think that that speaks to people enough that each unique struggle the character has in each book plays into that and makes it easy to stay invested in what's happening to her
Mm.
over the course of 3 books. So, I don't
So a
know.
lot of the stakes, it sounds like, are internal, so it doesn't
Mm,
really matter which timeline she's in. It's what kind of a person is she going to be? Will she find the answers? And for her, her story, even if she's hopping around, is her story. So there's a
mhm.
sort of linearness to that.
Yeah,
Interesting. So
yeah.
you said that by the time you got to the third book, you were keeping track of a lot of a lot of threads and timelines and all of that, but you're at heart a pantser. How on
Yes.
earth did you do that? Did you keep some file, or do you have any tips for anybody who finds themselves in a similarly tough spot?
Yeah, I mean, I think probably the normal person thing to do would be to keep notes and keep track of those things.
But
I
then you have to
I kind of
adjust the notes.
yeah,
It's
I kind of have
tough.
a brain for detail, and so I kept a lot of that stuff in my head. Um, in I it helped me because, of course, as you know, when you're putting out a book, you read that book 7,000 times before you put it out. So, it was very wired into my head each time I was writing the next book. So I'm like, I know exactly what happens at this point and this point, and to be fair, I didn't answer all of the questions in my main series, which my husband found a little bit frustrating when he read the third one. He's like, "You don't answer all the questions." And I was like, "That's because there's gonna be more books." And he's like, "But you're supposed to make sure that people are left wanting more." And he's like, "Oh, that's the questions." Exactly. Um, so there are some things that I specifically addressed question-wise, but then there were a lot of things I left open. And, um, I had a lot more of a sense of it's funny because I planned for this to only be a duology, and then got 75% of the way through the second book, and I'm like, I'm gonna have to write a third book. Um, but I was able to, because I don't answer a whole lot of questions in the first book, and then it leads into the second one, which gives us more questions, but then also we get a few of the answers. And so then I had smaller pockets of answers to address. And so I carried that into the third one and answered some of the major ones that really pertain to her specific story, but they don't answer all of how it works or how and I don't want to give too much away because there's a lot of things that um, go into the story that you find out through each book. Um, but it, I think because I was spending a lot of time very focused on the series itself, I put out the book in January 2022 and had the second book out November of 22 and then the third one out in last year. And so I was really focused on going from one to the next to the next. So I didn't have a lot to distract me and keep me from remembering all of the details. Um, so I don't know. I would recommend for most people, if you're going to do something like this, definitely keep more of a hard, notebook or something that will have all of those threads. For me, it was easy enough to keep it all in my head because I was just rolling right into the next one. Because I think I had started writing the third one before the second one was out, so I could adjust things if I needed to. Um, but like I said, I keep a lot of the answers vague enough that now I have books that I'm going to do that are going to answer some more of those questions, and gave just enough through the series to satisfy people but also make them question and want more, which is kind of a fun way to do it. But yeah, I don't know how I do what I do with this pantsing stuff. It's just the way I'm wired. So I don't know. I don't recommend it, but it works really well for me. So I don't know.
I mean,
That's
it
probably
makes sense if you're kind of obsessed over this story and you're thinking about it all the time, then it is easy to keep a lot of notes in your head. I've had a similar experience. Everybody says, "Oh, you should keep a series Bible," and I'm like, "That ship has sailed. It would take way too long to put that together."
yes.
I know the things, so I'm going to go. But then I started a new series right at the beginning. I started a kind of series Bible, and it's been very useful. It turns out.
Yeah. I
So
just had
maybe, yeah.
talking about keeping track of how old their main characters are and specific details about them. And I think because I'm a proofreader as well, I pick up on those little details while I'm rereading my own stuff. And I'm like,
Mm,
oh, I accidentally made this person, this age, or their eye color is this here and it's something else here. But generally, I think I have a mind for that kind of thing, and that's why I can pick it out even when I'm just proofreading somebody's book and I'm reading it for the very first time. I'll remember something that was in the very
mm.
beginning, and we're 3/4 of the way through and it's some different detail, and I remember that. And I'm like, "I'm pretty sure he wrote this differently in the beginning of the book. Let's go back and check it," or whatever it is. And so I have never had a problem with it in my books, but I also don't have a significant amount of time passing either, so I don't have to keep track of, age, when this happened, whatever. But I know when you have multiple characters, that gets complicated really quickly, and I have a very small cast of characters
Mm.
largely in this series, so that helps too. But yeah, I think a lot of people, the keeping the Bible thing, the story Bible and character Bible and all of those things are really great, and I'm sure there's templates for that to help you do all of those things, but it's just not my wiring, I guess. So I don't know.
Well, it sounds like being wired for that much detail is perfect for I mean, what a perfect skill for a proofreader and somebody who's gonna try to tackle alternate timelines. You have to be pretty detail oriented from the jump, I think, with or without a story Bible to be able to really sink your teeth into something like
Mhm.
that. Were there any unexpected challenges that kind of arose? You've already alluded to the fact that things got more complicated as the books went on, but did anything surprise you?
Mm. I mean, I think because I'm a pantser, a lot of things surprise me in the process. Um, I don't know. I'm trying to think specific situations. I mean, I've had some really great critique partners who pick up on things that, which is one of the reasons why I really recommend them, just things that, don't make sense to other people.
Hmm.
Or I had to in my second book, I had to rewrite an entire chapter, because I had a critique partner. It had to do with a court case and working with, um, a defense or a prosecutor, a state prosecutor, and I had a friend who was a state prosecutor. She's like, "This is not how it would go at all." Um, and that was helpful, actually. But I don't know anything that surprised me. I mean, my characters constantly surprise me. I never like they things pop up in the story that I'm like, "Oh, that's something in their past that I didn't plan on having." I feel like when I write a story, I'm telling myself the story in that first draft, and that's also how I get to know my characters. Like, I don't
Mm,
plan out, specific facets of their personalities, um, or the way they think or feel or respond, and then by the end of the book, they've kind of revealed themselves to me, and then sometimes I have to reconcile that with what I started with because I had a more vague sense of the characters, and I'm much more of a character-driven writer, so the stories, the plots are much more secondary to the journey that the character goes on, um, so I think that's the biggest thing whenever I write is that the characters tend to surprise me. They add something into their own backstory that sneaks in there without my intention, or how they react to a scenario or something suddenly reveals to me who they really are at their core.
mm,
So I think that's the most surprising thing for me. They'll say and do things that I'm like, "This was not how I planned this scene to go." Or, this was the major plot point I was working toward and it's gone in a totally different direction, but almost always because my characters reveal themselves in a different way or take a conversation or story or action and go in a completely different direction. And that still happens even though I had these established characters and I was writing a second and a third book, they still hit similar ways. My dog just walked into my Can you
huh.
no, can you go close the door, please? Thank you. And then my kid came in. So,
So
anyways.
it sounds like that's worked out for you though, the characters really taking over and especially since you are kind of cross genre, having a really strong character journey at the center, I'm sure is probably the main draw for people. You have an
Mhm.
interesting concept and then they'd stay because the characters are somebody that they could talk about.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it's
yeah.
interesting that you mentioned the prosecutor friend. I just one of my most recent interviews was with Leslie Budowitz about what writers get wrong about lawyers.
Ah,
Because there are a lot of us who just don't know all the little ins and outs of how all
yeah,
that would would go down.
yep.
So last thing is you mentioned a critique partner and the value of having somebody who can lay eyes on your work, even if you have that eye for detail, you know that it's internally consistent, but maybe somebody who's not as immersed still is not really going to understand what you're getting at. So,
Yeah,
how would you recommend newer writers to find critique partners? I mean, how did you find yours?
yeah, I've had several over the years. Um, they're almost always actually exclusively other writers. And it's been somewhat of an up and down process because there's also a level of skill that you kind of wanna look for, but I also had, this prosecutor friend, she was writing her first novel, so she was very green as far as telling a story, but she was really good at the detail, and she reads a lot too. She's a bookstagrammer as well. So she does a lot of book reviews and really takes the time to analyze story
Mm,
and her experience of it. And she was really helpful even outside of the legal elements that I had to get remotely right, because she said specifically, she's like, there's a lot of freedom in writing fiction, and she's not gonna hold people to a super high standard. It has to be absolutely accurate no matter what. She's like, "You have creative license," and even when she gave me feedback on this scene that it would never happen this way, she's like, "You can leave it because it's fiction, and you can do whatever you want as the author," and she's like, "If you want it to be more realistic," and I'm like, "I would like it to be as realistic as possible where I can, keep it that way."
right, you don't wanna take people out of the story who
Yeah,
know that.
yeah. And, I mean, I'm already writing about alternate realities, you have to suspend your disbelief a little bit anyway.
Of course.
So but when it comes to real world things, I would like to be closer to accurate, if not entirely correct. But, I personally believe in the benefit of a discerning eye, and I'm able to kind of set aside my ego a little bit and really take into consideration people's feedback, and I would prefer people who are a little harsher than not
Mm,
because I'd had some constructive feedback from people that was they weren't pulling punches, and I saw my writing level grow exponentially.
mm,
But it's hard to find people like that because 1, I've been a critique partner with people, I'm reading their work, and I've experienced the pushback when I've, given feedback and they defend their choices in the book
mm,
or their writing or whatever it was. And just seeing that, I'm like, "Okay, you're not really open to honesty." So I have to really temper how I approach these things or just let it go. And I feel like that does a disservice to both of us because then I'm not able to pour into that person and they're also not able to improve themselves. And so because I've seen that side of it and also have received the more constructive and critical feedback and seen how it really changes me and my thought process,
mm,
I crave that because I want to be better. And I've even seen when I read my first book versus my third book, there's even a gap in skill there. And you just improve over time. And that comes from being open to critical feedback. And not to say that people should rip you apart, but you absolutely want to be open to um, someone who's gonna be really honest with you and you need to take it. You don't have to accept it if you just disagree with it wholeheartedly, just ignore it. But really consider each bit of advice and feedback and then adjust accordingly. And it's hard to find someone who's gonna fit well in that way. So sometimes I look for people in the same genre. Sometimes it's reading their books and seeing their skill level and being like, "Yeah, they match where I'm at," and so you know that they'll be able to see in your story the kinds of things that maybe you might miss, or people who are at a higher level than you are. Like, those are the kind of people that I would seek out because their feedback is often more meaningful,
mm.
and
So is this
so
online that you're, connecting with people, like, over Bookstagram or is it local people that you know a little more personally?
been across the board. So I've had my earliest critique partner was a fellow writer who she went on to be a literary agent for a while and then she got published, traditionally published a year ago, I think her book came out. But I also knew her writing ability, and it was definitely one that I was like, we're equal or, right around the same level, but she also just had an eye for story. So I had
Mhm.
her giving me a lot of feedback, which helped. And she was somebody that I went to high school with
Mm.
and stayed friends with for a long time. And then I've done online groups that I've been connected with during or through writer groups. And then the prosecutor friend, we met through an online writer community and found out randomly that we both lived in Colorado and have been
Mm.
able to meet up and stuff like that. So, although she lives 2 hours north, but it was still cool because my books were set in Colorado as well. And then having the specific Colorado state prosecutor to speak into what literally, because every state is different.
Right.
Um,
Yeah.
but it was funny how we connected through an international writing group and
Mm.
happened to live in the same state. And then now I have a really awesome in person writing group that I meet with, and we swap work and can give a lot of feedback. So I've had all kinds of things, but I definitely would suggest looking in a lot of different places for that. If you can't find writers locally to you, find them online through various writing groups and communities. Um, I got a couple of them through different Facebook groups for writers, and um, but it is a little bit of a process finding the right person. So
Mm. Well, I appreciate the advice. Hopefully people out there who, especially those who are just starting out, but really any writer
yeah.
is able to act on that. So how can people find you and your work and everything that you're doing online, Tracy?
Yeah, you can check me out at traceybarski.com, and that will bring you to all of my books, my socials. I'm really active on Instagram as author Tracey Barski, but you can find me on TikTok as well. I'm just not as active there. Um, and all my books are on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, anywhere you can buy them online, and some of them are in they're in some bookstores, local bookstores here. Um, so in Colorado Springs and then in other cities in Colorado. So yeah, and I usually keep my website updated for events and that sort of thing because I do book signings and all of that good stuff. So yeah.
All right, well, perfect. I'll have those links down below if you want to look more at the alternate chronicles or anything else about Tracy and the upcoming events that you'll be a part of here in the next few months. So, thank you again for joining me and just letting me pick your brain about alternate timelines and all these things that I have not done myself. So, yeah, like this video if you like it, make sure to subscribe for more indie author life and helpful interviews and stuff. This is not my best outro.
This sounds
But anyway, look up Tracy Barsky and I'll see you next week. Bye.
awesome.